My name is Nadia Osei. I am 31 years old. At my bridal shower last June, my mother stood in front of my future in-laws and told them my father had died in debt, that he had left me nothing, that I was coming into this marriage with no financial foundation behind me. I sat at the head table and felt the shift in the room before anyone said another word. Then, 40 minutes later, a man in a suit knocked on the venue door, asked for me by name, and handed me something in front of everyone that changed what that afternoon meant entirely. No. My father, Emmanuel Osei, died when I was 22. He was 59 years old, and his death was sudden enough, a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in February, that none of us had any time to prepare for the shape of life without him. He had been a quiet, methodical man, an accountant by profession for most of his adult life, precise about numbers in the way some people are precise about words or music. He kept records of everything. He planned for contingencies I had never thought to worry about. He was the kind of father who slipped folded notes into your coat pocket before a long trip. Not romantic notes, but practical ones. The name and number of a mechanic in the city you were driving to. A reminder about an oil change that was coming due. He was also the kind of father who showed up in ways that were easy to take for granted while he was alive, and impossible to stop noticing once he was gone. He attended every school event I ever had, without exception, even the small ones, the science fairs with 3 attendees, and the Tuesday afternoon choir performances that ran 40 minutes too long. He drove me to my first job interview at 20 and sat in the parking lot the entire time so he could take me to lunch after, regardless of how it went. He never told me what to do with my life, never pushed toward a particular career or a particular kind of person to become, but he had a way of being consistently present that communicated something more durable than any advice would have been. He was there. That was the whole message. Whatever happened, he was going to be in the parking lot. He and my mother had been married for 26 years when he died, and I want to be careful and fair here about how I describe what their marriage was like, because it bears directly on everything that came after. They were not a happy couple in any obvious sense, at least not in the years I was old enough to observe them clearly. They were functional, they ran a household together, they raised me and my younger brother without visible crisis. But there was a baseline coldness between them that I had absorbed as normal for most of my childhood before I got old enough to understand that it was not actually inevitable between two people who had chosen each other. My mother, Gloria, had a way of treating my father's quietness as a deficiency rather than a personality. She found his methodical nature boring, and said so, not cruelly but consistently, in the way some people keep up a low-level commentary on the people closest to them without fully registering how it lands over years. My father absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, without visible reaction, going about his routines with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything. They stayed together, and I believe they cared about each other in whatever register was available to them by the end. But I also believe, with the clarity that comes from watching two people for most of your life, that my mother had long since decided my father was not the success she had expected when she married him, and that this had calcified into a quiet resentment she occasionally voiced when she thought no one was keeping score. After my father died, the estate process was handled by his attorney, a man named Douglas Feather, who had been my father's accountant turned lawyer for over 15 years. I knew Douglas slightly, had met him at family gatherings over the years, but was not closely involved in the legal or financial side of my father's affairs during the probate process. I was 22, finishing my final year of university, and my mother managed the estate administration, with Douglas mostly out of my direct involvement. She told me at the time that the estate was modest, that there were some debts associated with a small property investment my father had made years earlier that had not performed as expected, and that after everything was settled, there would be very little left. She was not dramatic about it, just matter-of-fact in the way she was about most things. I believed her. There was no reason not to. I was young, I was grieving, and financial administration during a probate process was exactly the kind of detailed procedural thing I had no framework for navigating on my own. I trusted my mother to handle it accurately, and I went back to finishing my degree. Over the following years, I built a life on what I had. I graduated, found work in marketing at a firm in the city, worked my way up steadily, paid off my student loans over 4 years, saved carefully the way my father had modeled for me, without my fully realizing he was modeling anything. I was not wealthy, but I was stable and moving forward, and the question of my father's estate was something I thought about occasionally, with a mild, ongoing sadness about what might have been, without ever examining it too closely. I met my fiancé, Andrew, about 4 years after my father died. He was a structural engineer, warm and organized, someone who found comfort in the same kinds of systems and plans that my father had valued. I liked that about him from the beginning, the sense that he was someone who showed up the way he said he would. We dated for 2.5 years before he proposed, and in that time he had met my mother several times and formed a polite, if not particularly warm, relationship with her. Andrew's family was from a comfortable background. His parents, Martin and Elaine, were kind people who had done well through 2 solid careers and some careful property investment over the decades. They were not wealthy in any extravagant way, but they had a financial stability that was visible in small ways: the house they lived in, the vacations they mentioned, the ease with which money was not a source of ongoing anxiety in their conversations. I was aware of the gap between their background and my own more modest one, but Andrew had never once made me feel that this mattered to him, and I had no particular reason to believe it mattered to his parents either. The bridal shower was planned jointly by my mother and Elaine, which in retrospect I should have understood was a setup for the particular kind of friction that happens when 2 women, with different assumptions about how things should be done, try to co-organize the same event. The venue was a private room at a restaurant Elaine had suggested and my mother had agreed to. About 30 guests were invited, a mixture of women from both families, plus friends of mine from work and university. In the weeks leading up to the shower, I had noticed my mother making small comments about Andrew's family that I did not love, but did not address directly because they felt too minor to confront and too persistent to quite ignore. She said once that Elaine seemed like the kind of woman who expected things to be done a certain way, said it in a tone that implied this was a character flaw rather than simply a preference. She mentioned Andrew's family's house in a way that suggested she had spent time measuring the distance between it and what she could offer. I understood, underneath all of it, that my mother was navigating her own feelings about sitting next to people whose resources were visibly greater than her own, and that some of what came out sideways was really about that gap. Understanding it did not make it easier to absorb. The afternoon started normally enough: mimosas, a lunch service, the opening of gifts with the particular combination of genuine pleasure and performative gratitude that gift opening at these events tends to involve. I was genuinely happy that afternoon, in the way that pre-wedding events can make you feel when everything around you is organized in service of a future you are looking forward to. At some point during the lunch portion, before the gifts had started, the conversation at the main table turned to the future Andrew and I were building together, the apartment we were planning to eventually leave for a house, the savings we were each bringing into the marriage, the general shape of the financial life we were constructing. This was not unusual conversation at an event with this kind of family mixture. It was the kind of talk that happens naturally when 2 families are combining. My mother, sitting near Elaine and Andrew's aunt, said something that she may have intended as straightforwardly honest, but which landed as something considerably more loaded. She said, in the context of a conversation about what Andrew and I would eventually be able to put toward property, that I should not count on any contribution from her side. She said my father had died with more debt than assets, that his estate had left me nothing, and that whatever Andrew and I built would need to come from what we earned together without any inheritance to supplement it. Elaine and Andrew's aunt received this information with the particular careful blankness that well-mannered people produce when they have just heard something they were not expecting and are managing their reaction in real time. I watched Elaine's face do something almost imperceptible, a small recalibration, before she said something mild and gracious about how many couples built everything themselves and that there was real value in that. But I felt the shift. It is hard to explain if you have not experienced it, the way a room's energy adjusts when new information reorders how people are looking at you. It was not hostility. Elaine and Andrew's family were not the kind of people who would be hostile about something like this. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to address, a mild repositioning of where I sat in relation to what they had assumed, a subtle recalculation happening behind polite smiles that I could feel even if I could not point to anything specific. I did not address it in the moment. There was nowhere to take it at a bridal shower with 30 guests and a gift table still waiting to be opened. I smiled and moved the conversation forward, an open presence with what I hope looked like unaffected pleasure, but the afternoon had taken on a quality it had not had before. My mother said what she said. About 40 minutes after that lunch exchange, while we were midway through the gift opening portion of the afternoon, there was a knock at the private room's door. A staff member from the restaurant opened it, and a man in a dark suit stepped into the doorway and scanned the room for a moment before asking, in a voice quiet enough not to fully disrupt the event, but audible to the tables nearest the door, whether Nadia Osei was present. I recognized Douglas Feather immediately, though I had not seen him in several years. He was older than I remembered, gray at the temples now, carrying a slim leather document case. I stood up from the gift table, confused but not alarmed, and crossed to the door to meet him. He apologized for interrupting and explained briefly that he had been trying to reach me for several weeks at an address that had turned out to be outdated, and that when he had contacted Andrew's workplace to ask if Andrew knew how to reach me, Andrew had mentioned the bridal shower and its location without thinking much of it. He said he had something that needed to be delivered to me in person with a signature, and that he was sorry for the irregular timing, but that the matter had already been delayed longer than he was comfortable with. He opened the document case and produced an envelope, which he asked me to open and review before signing the accompanying receipt confirming delivery. He said he could wait outside if I preferred privacy, but that he was required to witness my receipt of the document. I opened the envelope in the doorway of the private room, with 30 women at the tables behind me, and my mother somewhere in the middle of them. Inside was a letter from Douglas's firm, addressed to me personally, and attached to it was a copy of a secondary document my father had executed approximately 8 months before his death. It was a separate testamentary instrument, not part of the primary estate that had gone through probate, but a distinct legal arrangement that my father had structured with Douglas, specifically so that it would pass outside the normal estate process and would not be subject to the same administration my mother had handled. The document described a trust my father had established in my name and my brother's name jointly, funded over the course of 15 years through a series of modest, regular contributions that had accumulated and been invested conservatively over time. The total value of the trust at the time of Douglas's letter was slightly over $214,000, split equally between my brother and me. I stood in that doorway and read the letter twice. I understood it. The numbers were clear. I understood that my father, who had spent his career as an accountant and who had planned for contingencies I had never thought to worry about, had been making arrangements for my future for 15 years without telling me, in a structure deliberately designed to exist outside the estate my mother would be administering. I also understood, standing there, why he had designed it that way. I signed the receipt. I thanked Douglas and told him I would be in touch with his office early the following week. He apologized again for the interruption, shook my hand, and left. I turned back to the room with the letter in my hand. 30 women were looking at me with the kind of alert attention that settles over a group when something has clearly happened, but nobody yet knows what. My mother was looking at me from the middle of the room with an expression I had not seen from her before, something cautious and uncertain, like a person who has just realized they may have miscalculated something significant. I walked back to the gift table and sat down. Elaine, sitting nearby, asked gently if everything was all right. I told her yes, that it was a communication from my father's estate lawyer about a trust arrangement my father had made, and that everything was fine. I did not make it into a moment. I did not hold up the letter or explain its contents to the room. I set it face down on the table beside me and picked up the next gift to open, and said something about how we should keep going because we still had a lovely pile in front of us. The afternoon continued, but I was aware, without looking at her directly, that my mother had gone very still at her table. Andrew was waiting when I got home from the shower that afternoon. He had heard about the event from his mother, who had called him midway through the afternoon, not to alarm him, but because she thought he should know what had happened, both what my mother had said and what the envelope had turned out to contain. He had spent several hours sitting with that information before I walked through the door. We talked for a long time that evening, the kind of conversation that happens when two people are sorting through several different things simultaneously and need to be careful not to conflate them. Andrew said he had never had any concern about my financial background, that it was not a factor in anything he felt about our future together, and that the only thing that had bothered him about the afternoon was what my mother's statement had done to me in that room, the way I had been repositioned in front of people he cared about, without my knowledge or consent. He said that plainly and without drama, and I believed him because I knew him well enough by then to understand when he was being straightforward rather than diplomatic. He also asked, gently, whether I had known about the trust before that afternoon. When I told him I had not, that Douglas's arrival had been as much a surprise to me as to anyone else in that room, he was quiet for a moment before saying that your father clearly knew exactly who he was protecting you from and how to do it. He did not elaborate on what he meant, and I did not ask him to, because I had been thinking the same thing since the moment I read that letter in the doorway. I called my brother that evening and told him what had happened. He had received his own delivery from Douglas's firm the previous month at his home address, and had been wondering whether and how to tell me. He had not known how my mother would react, given what she had told us both about the estate years earlier, and had been waiting to understand the situation better before saying anything. We talked for a long time that evening, about our father, about the trust, about what it meant that he had structured it the way he had. My brother said something during that conversation that I have carried with me since. He said Dad always knew what he was doing with numbers. He always knew what needed to be protected and from what. He said it without bitterness, just as a statement of observation about who our father had been, the same man who put mechanics' phone numbers in coat pockets, the same man who planned for the contingencies other people forgot to anticipate. The conversation with my mother happened 3 days after the bridal shower, at her house, just the two of us. I had given myself those 3 days to sit with everything, to understand my own feelings clearly enough to be direct, without being reactive, to know what I actually needed from the conversation, rather than just what I was angry about. She did not deny knowing about the trust when I asked her directly. She said she had become aware of it during the estate process, that Douglas had informed her it existed, but that it was a separate instrument outside her administration, and that she had made a choice not to mention it to me at the time. I asked her why. She was quiet for a while before answering. She said that after your father died, the fact that he had built something separately, specifically structured so I would not be the one distributing it, told her something about how he had seen their marriage, and that sitting with that had been painful in ways she had not fully processed. She said that by the time she might have found a way to mention it to me, enough time had passed that it felt easier to leave it as Douglas's matter to resolve rather than hers. I told her I understood that this was painful for her. I meant it. I could see even then that the trust was not really about money for my father any more than it was really about money for me in that bridal shower doorway. It was about a man who had loved his children steadily and quietly for 15 years, while his marriage slowly showed him he needed to plan carefully for what would happen after he was gone. But I also told her that what she had said at the bridal shower, in front of Andrew's family, in a room full of people, about my father dying in debt and leaving me nothing, was not simply an omission. It was a statement she made knowing it was incomplete in a way that materially affected how people in that room would see me. And whatever the reasons behind it, whether grief or resentment, or the complicated feelings of a woman whose husband had structured his love for his children partly around protecting it from her, she did not have the right to use my inheritance as a way to manage her own pain at my expense. She cried during this part of the conversation. I did not harden against it, and I did not soften it away. I let it be what it was. We talked for about 2 hours that afternoon. She told me things about her marriage that I had not known, and some that I had half known, without having words for. She said she was sorry for what she had said at the shower, genuinely and specifically, not in the general way people apologize when they want a conversation to end, but in the particular way that means they have actually reckoned with the specific thing they did. I believed her. Andrew and I were married 6 weeks after the bridal shower. Our wedding was simple and warm, and full of people who genuinely cared about us, which is all a wedding actually needs to be. My mother was there. We are not the same as we were before that afternoon, but we are not broken either. Something between us has been named that was previously unspoken, and named things are easier to navigate than things that exist only as pressure without language. The trust money sits in an account that my brother and I have discussed carefully and are in no hurry about. My father built it over 15 years through modest, regular contributions that added up to something real, and neither of us wants to do anything with it that would dishonor the patience and intention behind how he built it. We are thinking about what he would have wanted it to do and taking our time getting there. I think about him often, the way I have since he died, but differently now. Before the bridal shower, I thought about my father with the particular sadness of someone who left without enough, who died before he had managed to build the security he had worked toward. Now I think about him with something that is closer to awe, a quiet, accumulating awe at the person who spent 15 years putting something aside for his children without telling them, who structured it carefully enough to survive a probate process and arrive at a bridal shower in a leather document case, who was still planning for the contingencies I had not thought to worry about long after the Tuesday morning in February when he stopped being there in person to do it himself. There is one more thing I want to say about Douglas Feather specifically, because his role in this is not incidental, and I have thought about it often since that afternoon. When I met with him the following week at his office to go through everything properly, I asked him whether he had known, when he came to the bridal shower, that my mother had told us the estate had left nothing behind. He said he had become aware over the years, through various indirect signals, that the trust had not been communicated to me, and that this was part of why he had been so persistent about tracking me down in person rather than simply mailing the document to an old address. He said my father had been very specific in his instructions about how the trust was to be delivered, that he wanted it to come in person from Douglas directly, with a signed receipt, and that Douglas had taken those instructions seriously for 9 years while he waited for the right moment and the right address. I asked him if my father had said anything, when he set up the trust, about why he wanted it structured the way he did, outside the main estate and outside my mother's administration. Douglas thought for a moment before answering. He said that my father had told him, when they set the trust up, that he wanted his children to have something that was entirely theirs, something that had been built for them and would reach them on its own terms, without passing through anyone else's hands or anyone else's version of events first. He said my father had not said anything critical about my mother when he gave those instructions. He had simply been very precise about what he wanted the money to do and how he wanted it to arrive. That felt exactly right when Douglas said it. My father was never a man who spoke badly of people, even when he might have had cause to. He was a man who planned carefully and quietly for the outcomes he wanted, and then made sure the planning was solid enough to survive whatever got in the way between the intention and the arrival. The trust did not arrive the way anyone expected, in a doorway at a bridal shower with 30 women watching, but it arrived. It found me. He made sure it would. The Mainam Gurporus.